At $0 in debt, you don't feel rich. That's the first thing nobody tells you. You expect the number 0 to feel like an achievement, a finish line, and instead it just feels like the ground, the place you're supposed to be standing, the absence of a problem rather than the presence of anything good. You're 22. You've just paid off the last few $100s on a credit card you opened in college for a textbook you don't even remember the title of anymore, and you stand in your kitchen looking at the balance that reads 0.00, and you wait to feel something. Mostly you feel tired. Mostly you feel like you've spent 4 years just getting back to a starting line everyone else seems to have been born standing on. At $3,000 in debt, it still feels manageable, almost invisible, the kind of number you can hold in your head without flinching. You put a security deposit on a credit card to build history, the way every article told you to, and then a car repair happened, the alternator, $1,100 you didn't have sitting anywhere, and the card absorbed it the way cards are designed to absorb things, quietly, painlessly, with a minimum payment that feels like nothing. You tell yourself you'll pay it off next month. Next month a different thing happens. There's always a different thing. At $12,000, the debt stopped being a temporary inconvenience and became a fact of your life, a permanent line item you budget around instead of toward. You've got the credit card, you've got a personal loan you took out to consolidate the credit card, which somehow made the number bigger instead of smaller because you kept using the credit card anyway once it had room on it again. You're 25 now. Your friends are starting to talk about saving for houses. You're doing math in your head at red lights about whether you can make the minimum payments and still afford groceries the week before payday, and you've gotten disturbingly good at that particular kind of arithmetic, the kind that happens fast, under pressure, with real consequences riding on getting it right. Somewhere in that same stretch, there's a particular conversation you remember more vividly than almost any other from those years, sitting across from a credit counselor at a nonprofit agency a coworker mentioned offhand, the kind of place that doesn't advertise much and mostly exists for people who've just started realizing the math isn't going to fix itself. She didn't lecture you. She just laid your statements out on the table, side by side, and asked you to tell her the story behind each one, not the number, the story, what was happening in your life the month each balance jumped. You found yourself, 25 years old, narrating your own life back to a stranger through the lens of a credit card statement, and somewhere in that hour you understood for the first time that debt isn't really a math problem at the level you were living it. It's a diary, written in interest rates instead of words, and most people never read their own diary closely enough to notice the pattern until someone else points a finger at it for them. At $30,000, the debt starts making decisions for you instead of the other way around. You didn't take the job you actually wanted 2 years ago, the one with more room to grow but a lower starting salary, because the offer that paid $4,000 more a year felt non-negotiable once you did the math on the minimum payments. You think about that decision sometimes, wonder what your life would look like if $30,000 of compounding interest hadn't been sitting in the room with you during one of the only real choices you've gotten to make about your own career. You don't resent the debt exactly. You've stopped thinking of it as something separate from you. It's not a thing you have anymore. It's a thing you are. At $65,000, it's not just credit cards and a car loan anymore. There's student debt in there too, the kind that arrived all at once on the day you graduated and has been quietly accruing interest in the background of every other number since, patient in a way that almost feels personal, like it's been waiting for you this whole time. $65,000 is the number where strangers stop being able to tell. You look successful from the outside at this point, you've got a title with the word senior in it, you've got a car that isn't falling apart, you post the same vacations everyone else posts. Nobody in any photo can see the math running constantly underneath it, the quiet triage between which obligations get the full payment and which get the minimum, every single month, forever, it feels like, though you know intellectually it isn't forever, it just feels that way at 2 in the morning when the feeling is the only one available. At $110,000, you've added a mortgage to the pile, and something strange happens to your relationship with the number. It stops feeling dangerous and starts feeling normal, because everyone around you has a similar number now, and the conversation has shifted from whether debt is a problem to whose debt is the smartest, whose interest rate is the best, whose leverage is working hardest for them. You've started calling some of it good debt, the mortgage especially, and you believe that, mostly, most days. But there's a version of the math you still don't do, late at night, the one where you add up every single monthly obligation across every account and compare it to what would happen if your income dropped by even a third. You don't do that math because you already know, somewhere underneath the part of you that calls this normal, that the number wouldn't survive contact with bad luck. At $180,000, somewhere between the mortgage and the second car, you have a conversation with a stranger on a flight that stays with you longer than it has any right to, an older man in the seat next to you who, somewhere over Ohio, mentions almost casually that he paid off a similar amount 15 years ago and still remembers, with total clarity, the exact day the last payment cleared. Says he sat in his car in his own driveway afterward, much like a scene you'd half remember from somewhere else if you'd ever heard it, and just breathed for 10 minutes before he could make himself go inside. You ask him how it felt. He says relief isn't really the word he uses instead is quiet, says the whole inside of his head got quiet for the first time since he could remember it being loud. You think about that word, quiet, the entire rest of the flight, turning it over against the noise that's been running constantly in your own head for years now, and you realize you don't actually know what quiet would sound like anymore. You've never lived inside it long enough to remember. At $200,000, the debt has a personality. You know its rhythms. You know which week of the month feels tight and which feels almost free, and you've built an entire emotional calendar around a number you'd never say out loud at a dinner party. People assume, looking at your life from outside, that you've made it, the house, the second car, the trip you took last spring that you're still, quietly, paying off in installments you don't mention. You've gotten extremely good at looking solvent. It's become its own kind of skill, performing financial normalcy while running a private spreadsheet that nobody else has ever seen, the one where every asset is matched, almost exactly, by a corresponding liability, so that the actual freedom you have, the real number that's yours and nobody else's, is so much smaller than what the house and the cars and the vacations would suggest to anyone watching. At $250,000, the debt stops being entirely yours, because somewhere around this point you got married, and marriage, among everything else it does, merges two private spreadsheets into one shared and far more complicated document neither of you fully understands the contents of until the wedding is over and the daily logistics of a shared life begin. Your spouse came in with student loans you hadn't fully accounted for during the engagement, the kind of number people mention once, early, and then never bring up again because bringing it up feels like keeping score in a relationship that's supposed to be past keeping score. You remember the first real conversation about it, a few months into the marriage, both of you sitting at the kitchen table with two laptops open, building a combined number neither of you had said out loud before, and the strange thing about that night wasn't the size of the number, it was the relief of finally not carrying it alone. Even though carrying it together meant the number itself had just grown by more than either of you had been carrying separately. At $300,000, you have a kid, and the debt takes on a texture it never had before, because now every dollar of interest isn't just slowing down your own future, it's quietly competing with a college fund you haven't started yet, a fund that everyone tells you needs 18 years of compounding to do its work properly and that you've already, through no fault of the baby asleep down the hall, lost the first year of. You do a kind of math at this level you never did before, not just what the debt costs you, but what it costs someone who doesn't exist as an adult yet, a tax levied backward in time onto a person who hasn't been born long enough to have an opinion about any of it. That math keeps you up more than the debt itself ever did at any number before it. At $350,000, the debt stops being a personal failure because at this level it's rarely just bad decisions anymore, it's a business that didn't make it, or a medical bill that arrived without asking permission, or a divorce that split a life in half and left both halves owing more than either could carry alone. You stop blaming yourself the way you did at $12,000, back when the number still felt small enough to be your fault. At $350,000, you've learned the harder, more useful truth, that debt at scale isn't really a morality story anymore, it's a math story, a story about interest rates and time horizons in which creditor calls first, and the shame that used to come baked into every statement has mostly burned off, replaced by something closer to exhaustion, and underneath the exhaustion, very quietly, the first real flickers of strategy. Because at this size, panic stops being useful and a plan becomes the only thing that actually moves the number. At $500,000, almost nobody is talking about a credit card anymore. This is the number of a small business loan that didn't go the way the projections said it would, or a medical situation nobody could have priced in advance, or a mortgage on a property that the market turned against right after you signed. At this level, the debt has stopped being something you carry and started being something you manage, the way a company manages debt, with spreadsheets and refinancing conversations and accountants who know your name. You've had to make peace with a number that would have seemed apocalyptic to the 22-year-old standing in the kitchen looking at a credit card balance of zero, and the strange thing you've learned, the thing nobody could have told that 22-year-old in a way she'd have believed, is that $500,000 of debt, structured right, serviced consistently, attached to assets that are actually worth something, can sit far more peacefully in a life than $3,000 of unstructured, directionless, quietly compounding credit card debt ever did. The number isn't the whole story. It never was. What the number is attached to, what it's buying, what it's backed by, that's the actual story, and almost nobody learns to read it that way until they've already lived through every chapter that came before. There's a version of you, somewhere around the $400,000 mark, that almost didn't make it to $500,000 the way you eventually did, almost made it instead to a much smaller number through a bankruptcy filing a lawyer talked you through in a consultation that lasted 90 minutes and felt like the longest hour and a half of your life. You sat in that office with a folder of statements, listening to a stranger explain, gently, professionally, exactly how the math could be reset, how the number could simply stop being your problem under the right legal framework, and you remember the specific, complicated relief of hearing that the worst-case scenario had a door in it, even as some older, stubborner part of you refused to walk through it. You didn't file. You're still not entirely sure that was the financially smartest decision available to you that year, and you've made peace with the fact that you'll probably never know for certain, because the version of your life where you did file is one you'll never get to compare against the one you actually lived. What got you through the gap between that lawyer's office and wherever you are now wasn't a windfall. There was no inheritance, no lottery ticket, no single dramatic turn that fixed things in one stroke the way the stories people tell about debt always seem to promise. It was duller than that, slower than that, a refinance here, a side project there, a habit of automatically moving any unexpected money, a bonus, a tax refund, a freelance check, directly at the highest interest balance before it ever had the chance to feel like spending money. None of it felt heroic while it was happening. It mostly just felt like Tuesday, then another Tuesday, then enough Tuesdays in a row that the number started moving in a direction it hadn't moved in years. You think about the girl in the kitchen sometimes, the one staring at a zero balance and waiting to feel like she'd made it. She had no idea what was coming, none of the messy, expensive, occasionally terrifying years between her and where you are now. She also had no idea that the number itself was never going to be the thing that decided whether her life felt stable or chaotic. It was always going to be what the number was attached to, and whether she understood it, and whether she stopped being afraid of it long enough to actually manage it instead of just surviving it one minimum payment at a time. Debt isn't a single story with a single ending, the cautionary tale everyone wants it to be, the morality play where the number always means the same thing no matter whose life it's sitting inside of. Zero can feel like nothing. 500,000 can feel, against every instinct your 22-year-old self would have had, like control. The number was never the point. The relationship you build with it, level by level, decision by decision, is the only part of the story that was ever actually yours to write.